Good morning, Signets, and welcome to our third virtual assembly. Today's value that we're going to be looking at is the value of dedication, which is where we recognise the importance of hard work, we work hard to achieve our ambitious goals, and we keep going even when things are difficult. Now, I'm filming today's assembly on Friday the 8th of May, which is VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. And I think it's a perfect example of how we can see our values, all of our school values in action, but particularly the value of dedication.
Let us remember those who gave their lives at home,
and it is still true that this is the biggest single challenge this country has faced since the war.
So firstly, a very brief history of VE Day. Today is the 75th anniversary of VE Day, which is when Victory in Europe was announced, which marked the beginning of the end of the Second World War. It came towards the end of 6 long years of conflict across the world, in which over 85 million people are thought to have died all around the world, both at home as civilians, but also as frontline fighters. It's also worth remembering that the Second World War happened just over 20 years after the end of the First World War, which also saw huge death and casualties. Now, it's particularly important to remember VE Day on this 75th anniversary for a couple of reasons. Firstly, 75 years after the event, the number of people who actually were there and experienced it as veterans is diminishing. And secondly, as so many people have said, there are many parallels between what we're experiencing at the moment and some of the hardships that were experienced at that time. Now I want to share with you a part of a speech from Winston Churchill, who was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during the Second World War, because I think there are so many lessons for us in this speech. He said, "My dear friends, this is your hour. This is not a victory of a party or of any class. It is a victory for the great British nation as a whole. We were the first in this ancient island to draw the sword against tyranny. After a while, we were left alone against the most tremendous military power that has ever been seen. And we were alone for a whole year." Now, there are 3 really important messages I want to draw out from this very short part of the speech. The first is the point around the victory being the victory of the great British nation as a whole. So many people contributed to the victory in the Second World War, and it's easy to remember perhaps those people who fought on the front line, who undeniably made huge sacrifices. But everyone who lived at that time also contributed to the victory. Everyone was doing their bit, from those people who took up different jobs, such as the women who started to work in munitions factories, and the huge millions of people who took to the field in order to grow food to feed the country, to those people who experienced rationing and gave up and made small sacrifices in their own home in order for there to be enough to go around for everyone. And the children who were evacuated from cities and had to be separated from their families in order to protect themselves and the lives of others. And finally, it's worth remembering the fear that would have been experienced by all of those people during that time and that toll on everyone's mental health and well-being. Secondly, we were the first in this ancient island to draw the sword against tyranny. I think this speaks to our value of ambition and also our value of integrity, about standing up to do the right thing even when it's difficult and even when other people are not following the same course. It is so important that we follow the example of our predecessors and we do what is right because it's the right thing to do, even when that is a difficult thing to do and even when we're not following or choosing the path of others. And finally, to really link back to that value of dedication, we were alone for a whole year. Now that refers to a time during World War II when a lot of Britain's allies had either been conquered by the Germans or the United States had not actually joined the war. And that was such a difficult time, a really scary time for the people in this country who must have believed that the end was in sight and there was only one inevitable consequence. This country would have been conquered by the Nazi German army. And yet, even within this really difficult time, people kept going, people showed their resolve, they were dedicated and kept going, and because they knew if they worked together, they would pull through in the end. So it is so important at this time that we remember the sacrifices of others. And in that video, it alluded to the fact that there were so many celebrations planned for this VE Day, for this 75-year anniversary. And so many of those things, because of the current situation we find ourselves in, can't actually take place. But actually, I'm not sure that that is so important, because the most important thing that we can do on this day is to remember the sacrifices that have been made. We don't need to do that by joining together and having huge parades and celebrations. But what we can do is make sure that we learn about what happened, make sure that the sacrifice of those people is never forgotten. We need to continue to learn and remember. We need to continue to appreciate the sacrifices that have been made so that these things never get repeated and that we never have to go through that experience again. And I think the quote from General Eisenhower, who was the general in charge of the United States forces during the Second World War, is so important and such a brilliant way to summarize the importance of remembering. He said, "The world must know what's happened and never forget. It's only by remembering those sacrifices that we can ensure that they never happen again and those sacrifices really were justified and really were valued." Now, I find, just to bring us to the close of the Assembly, I want us now to bring it back to our current situation and really think about how we can apply the lessons of VE Day and the lessons and the value of dedication in our current situation and our current lives. So what I want you to think about this week is how can you learn from the sacrifices of those that those people made during the war? Can you perhaps learn a little bit more about what they did and what happened during that time? And how can you show the same dedication that they did at this difficult time? It is so important that we remember, and it is so important that we continue to show those same values of dedication in our own situation. I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a really good week, everyone.